and I am a volunteer here at the park. For a few years ago, I had the privilege of being a seasonal ranger here. I'd come down during the summers when I was in graduate school and do programs like this and work as a ranger. And then since that time, every year on the anniversary of the battle, April 6 and 7 and 8, it's been my good fortune that they invited me back to come down here and do some of the programs that we're doing right now. By a show of hands, who has been to a Shiloh anniversary program such as this one before? That's pretty good. About half. About half return customers. For the rest of you, welcome. Thank you for coming. And for you guys too, welcome. Thank you for coming. And glad to see you again. Glad to see you here. I do want to let you know that you have a unique opportunity at Shiloh every year on the anniversary of the battle. During the rest of the year, the park does not have the resources to give regular tours. During the summer, they have just enough resources to do daily programming. You'll get about a 30-minute program on this topic or that topic from the Rangers at various spots. And that's a great way to experience the battlefield. Come back in the summer and the park rangers will give you programs. There'll be infantry programs. You can see how they fire the musket. They have they have a cannon, so they fire that every so often. And then you get these daily programs on the battle, on the sites. But only at the anniversary of the battle does Shiloh offer you the opportunity to come out and be on the field at the time, roughly, that a particular action is taking place. Only on the anniversary of the battle do you have the woods a little bit open so that you can see better than you normally could. At the time of the battle, this landscape was old growth forest, meaning imagine these forests with only the big trees here. All of the small ones are cleared out and all of the underbrush is cleared out. For most of the battlefield, these armies could see several hundred yards through the trees and could see each other. There are a couple of significant exceptions to that rule, where areas where there's very thick underbrush, and those we're going to get a chance to look at during the course of the day. But the programs we're going to do today are longer than they can normally offer. They cover more terrain than the park can usually offer in their programs. And we get to go to some places that you don't normally get to go during the rest of the year. So that makes these programs, the anniversary programs, very interesting programs. Well worth coming back for, as I'm sure the repeat visitors can attest. This morning's program, I forgot what I called it. I didn't put it on this. I believe it was Private Henry Morton Stanley seized the Civil War, but it might have been Battle of Shiloh. And the purpose of it is to walk the ground of the battle in the footsteps of one particular Confederate soldier. And this is most easily done when you pick a soldier who knows how to write. It's most easily done when you pick a soldier who writes very well, and it's most easily done when you pick a soldier who left us with a script that we can read and listen to as we move across the ground that he's describing. So, of course, who is our Confederate this morning? Henry Morton Stanley. For those of you who grew up after the underdog generation, Stanley and Livingstone may not be as familiar, as a daily familiar, ubiquitous reference. But yes, Henry Morton Stanley, after the Civil War, when he was an adventurer, went to Africa to find the elusive missionary Dr. David Livingstone, who'd gone deep into Africa to try to convert people there. Stanley travels up the Zambezi River, I think, looking for the source, looking for Livingstone. After a year, he finds the missionary off deep in the jungle, living with the natives there, and walks up to him and declares, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." That is our Stanley today. So how did this famous, world famous British adventurer and writer and journalist end up in the Confederate line of battle at Shiloh? So that's the beginning of our story. Stanley was born in Wales. John, his birth certificate reads, his Welsh birth certificate reads, John Rowlands, bastard. He was born in a broken family in Wales. Grew up in a broken home. Was early in his life was sent to a work school. So anybody who's read enough Charles Dickens knows the kind of life that John Rowlands was living as a young man. Away from his family, usually in institutions, orphanages, or work schools. When he was 15, he fled the school he was in, signed on to a ship, a merchant ship, to take passage to America. It was a terrible journey. The crew of the ship was very abusive to him and made him work hard. And when he got to New Orleans, he deserted, jumped ship, and took off into the French Quarter just as fast as he could. And there, with only the shirt on his back, he began to learn a little something about the American South. Got a job, worked I believe for a cotton warehouse, a cotton factory and a warehouse, and Stanley worked in that, watching slaves move the cotton up and down on the steamboats, dealing with customers, getting to know the city of New Orleans, for good and for bad, everything that city offers for a young man. Met a gentleman, according to Stanley, named Henry Hope Stanley. Henry Hope Stanley, an Arkansas planter who had brought his cotton down river to be sold on the docks of New Orleans. John Rowlands fell in with Henry Hope Stanley. They became good friends. Stanley became something of a mentor. And then when Stanley decided to go back up the river to his home in Arkansas, he took John Rowlands with him. Stanley always claimed in his writings that Henry Hope Stanley had adopted him. But there's no official record of Henry Hope Stanley ever adopting John Rowlands. It may have been wishful thinking in his older years, writing his memoirs, that he'd had this father, that his father figure was actually his father for a while. But we also know that by 1860, by the census of 1860, John Rowlands was not living on the plantation of Henry Hope Stanley. He was living on another plantation there in Arkansas. He changed his name, or at least changed what he called himself, and he now called himself Henry Morton Stanley. And at the age of 19, that was who he was, and that was where he was living. Living as a guest on a plantation in Arkansas near the White River. The war came. Young Stanley was not particularly interested in the Confederate cause, but everybody else in the neighborhood was. The young men all gathered together and formed the neighborhood young men all gathered together and formed themselves into a company called the Dixie Grays. At first, Henry Morton Stanley was not terribly interested in joining. He didn't like the idea of being in the Army, and he had only just escaped from a pretty regimented lifestyle a few years before, the workhouses. But, as often happens when war fever is sweeping the land, when everybody in a community is excited about an upcoming war, when young men feel the need to prove their manhood and their masculinity, well, pretty soon Henry Morton Stanley received a package at his civilian home, opened it up to find a petticoat. One of the young ladies from the neighborhood had taken notice of his failure to join the Dixie Grays and had sent him a petticoat. And being 19 years old, that of course to him seemed like plenty of excuse to commit himself to 4 years of combat and marching up and down the landscape fighting for Southern independence, even though he didn't particularly care for the cause. Didn't have any interest in it. Yes, he went down and he joined the Dixie Grays. He wasn't going to be left behind. He was going to prove his manhood. And he marched off to war with the Dixie Grays. They went up to Little Rock. They got organized with a regiment. A company of infantry would have been 100 men. The Dixie Grays, 100 men, marched to Little Rock, organized into a regiment with 9 other companies, making a regiment of 1,000 men at its original organization. His regiment was the 6th Arkansas Regiment. Colonel Hawthorne, originally. Now, how they got to Shiloh, we're going to skim right over that. We're going to take very little time with that. But from Little Rock, they marched up there, they trained a little bit, they got their muskets drawn from the Little Rock Arsenal, Little Rock being well west of the Army center of power. The arsenal at Little Rock was armed only with antiquated flintlock muskets from the War of 1812 and also used in the Indian Wars. And so the 6th Arkansas marched off with these antiquated flintlock muskets, just like their grandfathers had used in 1812 and their great-grandfathers had used in the Revolution. They were going to be pouring powder into those pans and shooting smoothbore 69 caliber buck and ball loads. They trained a little bit. They were transferred east of the Mississippi River, served in Kentucky, served at Bowling Green with the army there under the command of General Albert Sidney Johnston. When General U.S. Grant and his Union Army captured Forts Henry and Fort Donelson up here on the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, Bowling Green became indefensible, and without a battle, Johnston's army fell back to Nashville. Johnston's army falling back to Nashville to Henry Morton Stanley and his comrades mean they walk from Bowling Green to Nashville. As soon as they arrived at Nashville, the decision had been made that the city was indefensible, and so General Albert Sidney Johnston and his Confederates abandoned Nashville. and marched all the way down to Murfreesboro. They abandoned Murfreesboro, went on down into Huntsville. Finally, they got a train ride after walking from Bowling Green to Huntsville and transferred west to Corinth. At Corinth, General Johnston consolidated his army, determined to attack General Grant here at Pittsburgh Landing, gave orders to that effect. On the morning of April 3rd, 1862, General Johnston's army marched out of Corinth, and on the morning of April 6th, 1862, Henry Morton Stanley and his comrades in the 6th Arkansas Regiment, as part of Colonel Robert Shaver's Arkansas Brigade, the 2nd, 6th, 2nd, and 7th. Should have done vocal warm-ups here before I started. The 2nd, 6th, and 7th Arkansas Regiments, and the 2nd Confederate Regiment, making up Bob Shaver's brigade. On the morning of April 6th, they were on bivouac about a mile from here, just beyond the Union skirmish lines, and at dawn, they moved to attack. So we're going to make our first walk will be straight down this road to the next park sign like this one, which does interpret the attack of the Shaver's Brigade and Henry Morton Stanley. So,
Bjorn?
yes.
There's so many lights on.
Yeah.
2 cars down.
Ah, someone might have left their lights on. Yeah, thank you, Ruth. It is. Okay. All right, it's going to be about a quarter of a mile straight down the road.
You got an awesome ladder.
Battlefield is mapped and it's got every marker and monument on the battlefield. The grid is how to find it, and you can find all of Chalmers' markers and monuments. Also, before you start following it, go to the visitor center and ask the rangers, what they might have on Chalmers Brigade. They might be able to give you a little guide or point you toward the principal areas. The principal area you're going to visit is going to be the tour stop. I think it's number 11. It's the Union. They interpret it as the Union Field Hospital, but that was the area where Chalmers fought Colonel David Stewart's Union Brigade on the far eastern flank. It's fun terrain over there. Lots of deep ravines and brush-choked hollows. Yeah, sure. All right, just about 7 o'clock in the morning of, between 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning of April 6th, Robert Shaver's Brigade of Arkansans were just starting to move up this slope, fighting Union skirmishers as they fell back. At the same time, General Sterling Wood's brigade was moving to the northeast in this direction. And Colonel Shaver's brigade topped this rise right along here. That's why you have this Union line of defense interpretive plaque with Henry Morton Stanley on it. Shaver arrived at this position, faced off with a Union line of battle, and we've walked past the Union tablet, the blue tablet on the way down. You probably noticed it. And dodge behind the tree, you can see there it is. That's the Union line of battle, where that tablet is. And this is the Confederate line of battle at about 7 o'clock when the Battle of Shiloh finally becomes a general engagement, to use the terms of the time. That means now, at this moment, there's no skirmishers in front. The skirmishers have all cleared out. The lines of battle, thousands of men, marching elbow to elbow, have halted in front of each other to load their muskets and fire volleys into each other's faces at this range. And so that's where so right now is where the Battle of Shiloh begins in earnest. Now what happens in the battle, I'm just going to briefly say, and before we go on to let Stanley do the talking, during the course of this fight, Colonel Wood's brigade is coming up, General Wood's brigade is coming up from this direction, moving in the northeast, which normally would be beneficial to these Confederates. They can get around the end, right? They can get around the end and flank that Union line of battle, which only really goes just across the road. Unfortunately, with all the smoke and the firing, with all of the thick woods, with all of the disorganization, those Confederates miss the Union flank and they march right between the two facing line of battles. So while Shaver and Peabody are shooting at each other, and this entire landscape is covered in thick white smoke, the Confederates of Wood's brigade march right between the lines of battles, and they get shot to pieces. And the men in Wood's brigade are getting shot from behind. They hadn't expected that. They panic and they rout, and they come flying back straight up into the Confederate line of battle. They strike the left of Colonel Shaver's brigade. Colonel Shaver's brigade becomes disorganized, and everybody retreats down the hill. At that point, Wood and Shaver both have to get their people reorganized. The battle calms down for a little bit. They get the people reorganized, they come back up, and the battle starts anew, and then they finally push the Union forces off of that position. Now that's what happened in the battle. Let's look at what Stanley has to say about it. By 4 in the morning, we rose from our camp bivouac, and after a hasty refreshment, we formed into line. We stood in rank for half an hour or so while the military dispositions were being completed all along the 3-mile front. Day broke with every promise of a fine day. Next to me, on my right, was a boy of 17, Henry Parker. I remember it because while we stood at ease, he drew my attention to some violets at his feet and said, "It would be a good idea to put a few into my cap. Perhaps the Yanks won't shoot me if they see me wearing such flowers, for they are a sign of peace." "Capital," I said. "I will do the same." So we plucked a bunch of the violets and arranged them in our caps, and the men in the ranks laughed at our proceedings. We loaded our muskets and arranged our cartridge pouches ready for use. Our weapons were obsolete flintlocks, and the ammunition was rolled in paper cartridges, which contained powder, a round ball, and 3 buckshot. When we loaded, we had to tear the paper with our teeth, empty the little powder into the pan, lock it, empty the rest of the powder into the barrel, press paper and ball into the muzzle, and ram home. That's how to fire one shot. Then the orderly sergeant called the roll. Bow out, let's let this guy get past. Then the orderly sergeant called roll. And we knew that the Dixie Grays were present to a man. A young aide galloped along our front, gave some instructions to the brigadier, who confided the same to the colonels, and presently we swayed forward in line with shouldered arms. Newton Story, big, broad, and straight, bore our company banner of gay silk, which the ladies of the neighborhood had made for us. Now let's move forward to the Union line of battle. We'll pick it up there.
Downhill now. Are you going? Oh, yeah. I'm fine.
Hardly stretch our legs, but we have covered the intervening terrain between the two lines of battle. Here at this position, the 25th Missouri was in position from 7:30 to 8:30 before they were driven back to their camp, fighting against Shaver and Wood on the next rise here. We pick up Private Stanley. As we tramped solemnly and silently through the thin forest and over its grass, I noticed that the sun was not far from appearing, that our regiment was keeping its formation admirably, that the woods would have been a grand place for a picnic, and I thought it strange that a Sunday should have been chosen to disturb the holy calm of these woods. Before we had gone 500 paces, our serenity was disturbed by some desultory firing in the front. "They're at it already," we whispered to each other. "Stand by, gentlemen," said our captain, S.G. Smith. Our steps became unconsciously brisker, and alertness was noticeable in everybody. The firing in front continued at intervals, deliberate and scattered, as like target practice. We drew nearer to the firing, and soon a sharper rattling of musketry was heard. "That is the enemy waking up," we said. Within a few minutes, there was another explosive burst of musketry. The air was pierced by many missiles, which hummed and pinged sharply by our ears, pattered through the treetops, and brought twigs and leaves down upon us. "Those are bullets," Henry whispered in awe. Let's move on into the woods here. There's a tablet. What happened to the old park trail?
That wasn't fair. Pure words are never spoken. Back you avoid them, I don't. I didn't like the face. I saw the hat. I don't know. Got a friend who's a season ticket holder. Oh, really? Close Colter. Anything like around? Yeah, he's going to go to everything, but I think he's got... Yeah. Well, it's going to be a regional team. It's not that big of a one.
Yeah.
That was good in the winter. They got had warm right after walking.
Here, we were looking for the pines. We found the pines. Mona got us here.
But for yours takes one get sun.
Yeah. What I always do is I always try to miss what I'm looking for on the side that I know there's a trail. So if I miss it on the other side, I'll go right off into the woods and you'll never hear from me again. But yeah, I'm off in the swamp. But if I miss it, even it's okay to miss as long as I find a trail. All right, we caught up. Here we're at the position of the 21st Missouri Union Infantry of General Everett Peabody's regiment. All of that terrain we just covered during the battle would have been a full, complete, uninterrupted line of battle. About 2,000 to 2,500 Union soldiers in line of battle, firing in that direction toward Bob Shaver's Arkansas Brigade. We have come this distance so that we are actually on the axis of advance now of the 6th Arkansas Regiment. They were over toward the right end of Shaver's brigade. So where we were at the Henry Morton Stanley wayside, we were a few hundred yards from where he actually was. Now we are actually on ground that Stanley passed over during the course of the attack. A red marker like this one, you can't really see it because it's facing the other direction, but it's a couple hundred yards down this trail. And from that we will pick up the narration, Stanley's narration of his first experience in battle. At 200 yards further, the dreadful roar of musketry broke out from a regiment adjoining ours. It was followed by another further off, and the sound had scarcely died away when regiment after regiment blazed away and made a continual roll of sound. "We are in for it now," Henry said. But as yet we had seen nothing, though our ears were tingling under the animated volleys. "Forward, gentlemen, make ready," urged Captain Smith. We surged forward, for the first time marring the alignment. We trampled recklessly over the grass and the young sprouts. Beams of sunlight stole athwart our course. The sun was up above the horizon now. Just then we overtook our skirmishers, who had been engaged in exploring the front. We passed beyond them. Nothing now stood between us and the enemy. "There they are!" was no sooner uttered than we cracked into them with leveled muskets. "Aim low, men," commanded Captain Smith. I tried hard to see some living thing to shoot at, for it appeared absurd to be blazing away at shadows. But still advancing, firing as we moved, I at last saw a little row of little globes of pearly smoke, streaked with crimson, breaking out with sportive quickness from a long line of bluey figures in the front. And simultaneously there broke on our ears an appalling crash of sound. The series of fusillades following one another with startling suddenness, which suggested a mountain upheaved and huge rocks tumbling, thundering down a slope, and the echoes rumbling and receding into space. Again and again, these loud, quick explosions were repeated, seemingly with increased violence, until they rose to the highest pitch of fury in an unbroken continuity. All the world seemed involved in one tremendous ruin. What Stanley is describing here is volley firing, the goal of line of battle general engagement. Not with everybody loading and firing on their own at will. This is the goal, to get the soldiers loading and firing 3 shots a minute on the order, so that every regiment, every battalion can blow out a cloud of lead at the enemy. Did they have machine guns in the Civil War? Yes. They're called regiments, because the same purpose a machine gun serves on the modern battlefield, putting enormous amounts of fire onto a target, an enormous volume of lead onto a target to wipe it out. That is the purpose of volley firing. That's why you get 500 men in 2 lines firing at the command, ready, aim, fire. That was what was happening at that moment. This was how the conflict was ushered in, as it affected me. I looked around to see the effect on others, and was glad to notice that each was possessed of his own thoughts. All were pale, solemn, and absorbed, but beyond that it was impossible for me to discover what they felt. I felt that they would gladly prefer to be elsewhere. It might be mentioned, however, that at no time were we more instinctively inclined to obey the voice of command. We had no individuality at this moment, but all motions and thoughts were surrendered to the unseen influence that directed our movements. Probably few bothered their minds with questions of their own selves. That properly belongs to other moments, to the night, to the interval between waking and sleeping, to the first moments of dawn. Not when every nerve is tense and the spirit is at its highest pitch of action. Though our senses were acute, we plied our arms, loaded and fired with such nervous haste as though it depended on each of us how soon this fiendish uproar was hushed. My nerves tingled, my pulses beat double quick, my heart throbbed loudly and almost painfully, but amid all the excitement, my thoughts took in all of the sound, the sight, and the view. I listened to the battle raging far away on the flanks, to the thunder in front, to the various sounds made by the leaden storm. I was angry with my rear rank because he made my eyes smart with the powder of his musket. I felt like cuffing him for deafening my ears. I knew how Captain Smith and Lieutenant Mason looked, how bravely the Dixie Gray's banner ruffled over Newton Story's head, and that all hands were behaving as though they knew how long this would last. Back to myself, my thoughts came, and with it the whirring bullet that fled into the blue-bloused ranks affront. Through the lurid haze, the contours of their pink faces could not be seen, but their gappy, insensitive line revealed their mood clearly. And so here, what is happening is the two lines of battle are pounding at each other. What happened historically was Colonel Shaver was able to bring up two batteries of artillery. About 8 cannon were pulled right on up into the front line. The cannoneers loaded canister, the 27 lead balls in that huge shotgun round for a cannon, and started blowing huge holes in the Union line. At that time, Colonel Shaver consulted with his commanding officer, and they decided it was time to fix bayonets, charge bayonets, raise the rebel yell, and charge straight into the enemy line. And Stanley gives us a description of that attack, including the psychological effect on himself and his comrades of making that rebel yell phenomenon. We continued advancing, step by step, loading and firing as we went. To every forward step, they took a backward step, loading and firing as they withdrew. 20,000 muskets were being fired at this stage. Though accuracy of aim was impossible, many bullets found their desired billets on both sides. After a steady exchange of musketry, which lasted some time, we heard the order, "Fix bayonets!" on the double quick, in tones that thrilled us. There was a simultaneous bound forward, each soul doing his best for the emergency. The Federals appeared inclined to wait for us, but at this juncture our men raised a yell. Thousands responded to it and burst into the wildest yelling it has ever been my lot to hear. It drove all sanity from among us. It served the double purpose of relieving pent-up feelings and transmitting encouragement along the attacking line. I joined in the shouting like the rest. It reminded me that there were about 400 companies like the Dixie Grays who shared our feelings. Most of us, engrossed in the musket work, had forgotten that fact. But the wave and wave of human voices, louder than all the other battle sounds together, penetrated to every sense and stimulated our energies to the utmost. "They fly!" was echoed from lip to lip. It accelerated our pace and filled us with a noble rage. Then it deluged us with rapture and transfigured each Southerner into an exulting victor. At such a moment, nothing could have halted us. Those savage yells and the sights of thousands of racing figures coming toward them discomfited the bluecoats. And when we arrived upon the place where they had stood, they had vanished. Then we caught sight of their beautiful array of tents, before which they had made their stand. The half-dressed dead and wounded showed what a surprise our attack had been. We drew up in the enemy's camp, panting and breathing hard. Some precious minutes were thus lost in recovering our breaths, indulging our curiosity, and reforming our line. Military equipments, uniform coats, half-packed knapsacks, bedding, and a new, superior quality. These all littered the company streets. Let's head on down the trail to the Union camps. Although, as I don't know if I remembered to mention it up front, but I've warned everybody, and I think a lot of you have already made plans. This program ends about a mile from your cars, a little more than a mile from your cars. Now I'm going to walk back, so you can all walk back with me. Some people have already knew that, and they've arranged to. They had cars waiting at the end of the hike. But from here, we're going to head. I'm not going to go straight through the woods. We're going to head down and take a trail about 800 yards through the woods to another field, then straight across that field for another 500 or so yards. Lots of great material to cover. And then we're going to end it down there and then head on back to our cars from there. Back to Stanley. When you're at Shiloh, you see these tablets that look like tents. Those are the markers of the camp, of a camp. In that case, that is the camp of the 12th Michigan Infantry, and this tablet denotes that this is the stand. This is where the 12th Michigan made their last stand in front of their camp as the Confederates made that charge. The same one that Stanley just narrated. Now, the ground we just covered from that last to here, they covered running. In a bayonet charge, and so that happened with the entire brigade, the entire Confederate brigade of Shavers, Arkansas, and then Wood's brigade over here covered that ground at a run on that morning. That is why when the Confederates reached this point, and the Federals had skedaddled, and Prentice's troops, including the 12th Michigan and the 21st Missouri, had disappeared to the north, the Confederates stopped. They captured the tents, and as far as the Confederate soldiers were concerned, that was good enough. They'd won the battle, they captured the enemy camp, they fell out, and they began plundering the Union camp. Now, the Confederate plan of battle was to turn the left flank of Grant's army, which is still well down in that direction, drive them away from the Tennessee River and north and east into the swamps more than 3 miles away. So the running charge stopped about 3 miles short of where it needed to actually go. But the Confederates, for now, they hadn't eaten in 24 hours, they hadn't slept the night before, or they'd been on bivouac out in line of battle. They just fought this very bloody battle. It was the first battle any of them had ever been in. They won it, as far as they were concerned. They drove the Yankees from their camps, and so they stopped. The men fell out, and they began pillaging the camps. They found uneaten breakfasts still, over the fire. They found the federal sutlers had set up their shops. So there was cheese and sardines to steal from the sutler shops and eat. There's all of this to do, but the clock was ticking. And every minute the Confederates spent plundering, those Federals that retreated were spending that time reorganizing and getting ready to make another stand. Now, what the Confederate generals, what the Confederate commanders here, what happened in their minds is very important to how the Battle of Shiloh turns out. So let's go back to the plan of battle before we move on. I just said it, and I'm going to repeat it again because it's going to be important throughout the day. The Confederate plan of battle, as sent down by General Albert Sidney Johnston, We will turn the left flank of the enemy, the east flank of the enemy, drive them away from the river and into the swamps. That means when you're here in these woods right now, that means if you have turned the left flank of the enemy, it is now time to reposition the army from north to northwest so that we can now begin driving the Yankees into the swamps. We've got them on the run. We've driven them out of the camp, and now we're going to drive them into the swamps. That's the second necessary step. Unfortunately, they can't take that step because the Confederate soldiers have fallen out to plunder. And so it takes a long time, about 45 minutes, for Confederate commanders to get their men back in line. Down the line here, General Johnston is himself trying to get Confederate soldiers back into line and reorganized. He's got that little tin cup that he picked up, and he says, "This will be my plunder. Now come on, let's go." And so it took them about 45 minutes to get reorganized, and then they turned to the northeast. Now, this is not the story that Stanley's going to tell. His is a different one, but it's crucial to how the battle turns out, because as we know, there are still lots of Federal soldiers east of here. The Confederates had not turned the left flank of the Union line. They had punched a hole in the middle of it. And there are still thousands of Federal troops to the east of here. And it will be later in the afternoon, and that'll be other programs, when General Johnston has to take troops over there and finally try to ultimately turn the left flank of the enemy. At this point, what the Confederates have done, they've pierced the center of the enemy line, and now they're making a wrong turn, turning left instead of right. What we're going to do next, like I said, our goal is about 800 yards through those woods. I would rather walk 100 yards down the paved road here, get onto a nice, well-maintained park trail, and take that. It's actually going to be a little quicker than pounding through the woods. I've tried it both ways. So even though I consider myself a hardy Boy Scout, I'm going to take the well-blazed trail. Follow me.
When I'm here by myself, I go a straight line. So you better have something to give you
Now, one of the big surprises that the Confederate commanders encountered, and the Confederate soldiers encountered, is having taken that camp, they thought they'd won. Took them 45 minutes to reorganize, get their men back in line, and as soon as they started moving, with the expectation that they would sweep the enemy into the swamps, they promptly ran into another camp. There was another Union camp right along this road. We're beyond the east end of it now, but by the time you get to where the road curves there, that would have been campsites. And there were Federals, in this case the 49th Illinois Regiment, arrayed in front of their campsite. The marker here denotes another position of the 49th Illinois Regiment. Then other Illinois regiments stacked up in that direction, Colonel Henry Wraith's brigade. So, what Stanley had told us, in his mind, it wasn't any 45 minutes. He said some precious minutes were lost. Thus, in recovering our breath, indulging our curiosity, and reforming our line. And then he continues, as they advanced through that area we just came through, meantime, a series of camps lay behind the first array of tents. The resistance we had met enabled the brigades in the rear of the advance camp to recover from the shock of the surprise. But our delay had been long enough to give them time to form a proper line of battle. I had a momentary impression that with the capture of the first camp, the battle was over. But in fact, it was only a brief prologue to a long and exhaustive series of struggles that took place that day. Continuing our advance, we came in view of the tops of another mass of white tents. And at almost the same time, we met a furious storm of bullets, pouring over us from a long line of bluecoats, whose attitudes of assurance proved to us that we should have tough work here. But we were so much heartened by our first success that it would have required a good deal to have halted our advance for long. Their opportunity for making a full impression on us came with terrific suddenness. The world seemed bursting into fragments. Cannon and musket, shell and bullet lent their several intensities to the distracting roar. I likened the cannon with its deep bass to the roaring of a great herd of lions, the ripping, cracking musketry to the incessant yapping of terriers, and the windy whisk of shells and the zipping of mini bullets to the swoop of eagles, and the buzz of angry wasps. All the opposing armies of gray and blue fiercely blazed at each other. After being exposed for a few minutes to this fearful downpour, we heard the order, "Lie down, men, and continue your firing." Before me was a prostrate tree, about 15 inches in diameter, with a narrow strip of light between it and the ground. Behind this shelter, a dozen of us flung ourselves. The security that it appeared to offer restored me to my individuality. We could fight and think and observe better than out in the open. But it was a terrible period. How the cannon bellowed and the shells plunged and bounded and flew with screeching hisses over us. Their sharp rending explosions and hurtling fragments made us shrink and cower, despite our utmost efforts to be cool and collected. I marveled as I heard the unremitting patter, snip, thud, and hum of the bullets, how anyone could live in this raining death. I could hear the balls beating a merciless tattoo on the outer surface of the log, pinging vivaciously as they flew off at a tangent from it, and thudding into something or other at a rate of 100 a second. One, here and there, found its way under the log and buried itself into a comrade's body. One man raised his chest as if to yawn and jostled me. I turned to him and saw that a bullet had gored his whole face and penetrated into his chest. Another ball struck a man a deadly rap on the head, and he turned on his back, showed his ghastly white face to the sky. "It's getting too warm, boys," cried a soldier, and he uttered a vehement curse upon keeping soldiers hugging the ground until every ounce of courage was chilled. He lifted his head a little too high, and a bullet skimmed over the top of the log and hit him fairly in the center of the forehead. He fell heavily on his face. The officers, with one voice, ordered the charge, and the cries of "Forward! Forward!" raised us as with a spring to our feet and changed the complexion of our feelings. The pulse of action beat feverishly once more, and though overhead was crowded with peril, we were unable to give it so much attention as when we lay it on the ground. Just as we bent our bodies for the onset, a boy's voice cried out, "Oh, stop! Please stop a bit! I have been hurt and cannot move." I turned to look and saw Henry Parker standing on one leg and dolefully regarding his smashed foot. In another second, we were striding impetuously forward towards the enemy, vigorously plying our muskets, stopping only to prime the pan, ram and load down, and then with a spring or two, we would fetch up to the front, aim, and fire. This was the attack that carried Shaver's brigade through this camp, at which point they encountered this wide open field. At this point, they could have looked all along, down through the camp and to the right, and could have seen that a fairly constant line of Confederate forces had managed to redeploy facing northeast and were attacking. This was the largest single consolidated, coordinated attack the Confederates made in the entire battle. It took them several hours to scrap through that first row of camps. It took them 45 minutes to get reorganized, but now with the Union line going from along this road, through the woods, and then along the other side of this field, the Confederate line was finally making a massed attack of over, at this point, about 16,000 Confederate soldiers rushing forward across these fields. Union line supported by a battery of artillery. You can see it in the far corner of that field. Other artillery over here and still more over there. The Confederates of Shaver's brigade pushed out of the woods and straight across the review field for the next attack. And we're going to follow it straight on to a tablet that's straight across the field there.
That's the one that's
This is a wet field.
I mean, that might, you know, but I think